What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you end up enjoying this video, doing any of those helps the video to do well and the channel to do well, and ensures I can continue making this content daily for many years to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the video, please be sure to share them in the comments below, as I always read all of them, even if I don't always get the chance to respond to them all. Last but not least, if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and all that, please be sure to check out the join button somewhere around the subscribe button. If you click on that, it will let you join the channel membership for as low as $2 a month, and you get special access to emoticons you can use when you comment, and special icons that appear next to your name as well. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall. It's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel further. Without further ado though, guys, we'll get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. This is the first time I'm going to be sharing this story. I'm a female, now 22 years old. I'm only 5'1", and I don't really have many means of protecting myself. When I first left my home, I got an apartment and a job at an exclusive club in LA while studying online. I was 19 years old when I first started working there and learned very quickly the environment I was in. Creepy older men, cheating husbands, 0 women would ever walk in unless they worked at this club. The good service money kept me around for way longer than it should have probably. I always took my breaks outside in the back. I just scrolled on my phone and sat down on one of the benches until it was time to go back in. We all did this pretty much, a breath of fresh air from the cigar smoke inside. As I did my usual routine, this was the first time I'd ever seen a woman I didn't work with, even in the parking lot. I assumed a husband had gotten caught up or something, and did something she didn't like. That quickly became far from the truth. She walked up to me, very well put together. Expensive bag, expensive heels. Got dropped off from a very nicely priced vehicle as well. It had New York license plates in the front, which wasn't really normal in LA. When she got close enough to me, she asked me to help her pick up some change that had fallen underneath her vehicle. I don't think she knew I'd noticed she'd just been dropped off, and that was all I could think of at least. I declined and apologized. My break was about to be over. I asked her if I could get one of the bouncers to assist her instead, but she declined immediately. She tried to assure me it wouldn't take too much of my time, but I still refused. I went back to work and told the other girls I worked with to be careful. This was an incredibly suspicious person in my opinion. After work, I drove home to study and get some sleep. My apartment was on the first floor, in a non-gated area, with windows in my bedroom and living room that had views of the parking lot. It was kind of luxurious. I sat down on my couch and pulled out my laptop. I proceeded with my after-work routine. 20 to 25 minutes after I got home, though, I suddenly saw what looked like the flash from a phone camera straight in my living room. What the f***? Immediately, I ran to the window. There was the very same black vehicle, parked right in front. I closed my blinds and immediately called the police. They showed up, looked around, and asked some questions. They did show up 15 minutes after I called, so I'm not sure if I should have expected them to find anything anyway. I do wish they did, though. 2 weeks later, I'm at my local pet store with my German Shepherd. She's my rock and protector. I took her wherever I could after this incident. As I was walking through the store, I recognized that same lady across the aisle. Her face, the same outfit, the same woman who had come up to me while I was at work. I made sure my dog could see her, and that she could see my dog as well. Thankfully, my dog was trained, so I wasn't as scared of this person this time. I waited for her to leave before checking out and walked out towards my car. I found a weird note left on my windshield. I got in and drove straight home without reading it. When I did finally arrive, I took it out. It was some BS about accidentally hitting my car or something. I don't know why they even left this. My neighbors keep their eye out for me and let me know when they saw that person around. A lady even came by and asked my neighbor if I was single and acted like they'd seen me around the complex. Little things happen still. Random calls with weird voicemails, random tissues on my car, other things I choose to ignore. This has been going on for 3.5 years now. I haven't seen that lady in person since, but they definitely find ways to let me know they're still around. I grew up living out in the country. My parents had a house that was set in a hollow and surrounded by tons of hills and forests. Even though I used to spend a lot of time exploring those hills, I was always able to find new places each time. It was great during the fall, actually. When I was 12, I went out for a good adventure. It was quite brisk outside, so I made sure to put a jacket on. The leaves had already turned for the fall, and the countryside was absolutely beautiful. I got started pretty early in the afternoon because it got dark pretty quickly. The last thing I wanted was to get caught in the dark out in the middle of the woods. I had been hiking for a few hours through the forest when I began going downhill. At the very bottom of this hill, there was a huge treeless field. I had never seen it before. I was really fascinated, but even more interesting to me was the huge dilapidated barn I saw sitting in the middle of this field. Now, finding abandoned barns out in the hills is not an unheard of experience. In fact, I quite often came across many old abandoned buildings that had been buried in trees and bushes. This was different though. This was enormous, easily the biggest barn I'd ever seen in my entire life. Very excited, I headed down towards it. I noticed that the sun had descended a bit in the sky, and I cursed at myself for not leaving the house earlier. As it was, it seemed no matter how little time I spent exploring the barn, it would be quite dark by the time I got home. I figured it would be worth it, though. I really didn't expect to find anything interesting inside the barn, but it was still a bit of an adventure for me. I didn't realize exactly how huge this thing was until I was actually standing right outside of it. It was easily as tall as a 5-story building. The boards were old, and the entire building was graying. It was weathered down pretty bad. Though I stood in front of the huge doors, which looked fairly solid as well, I wasn't even sure if I was going to be able to open them. I looked around, starting to get slightly nervous that someone who owned the land the barn was on might be around. I would have been able to see if anyone was, though the barn likely had been empty for years, maybe decades by the look of it. It seemed there wasn't much for me to be afraid of. However, tell that to a 12-year-old boy trying to explore with an active and vivid imagination. I opened the door, which wasn't locked. I pulled it open just enough for me to slip inside. Once I got in, it was even more awesome than I'd thought it was. The interior of this barn was wide open and plain enormous. There were many different lofts, which were accessible by trapdoors and ladders, and hay everywhere. Tons of tools such as pitchforks and sickles hung on the walls. I searched around, and I felt like this was the coolest place I had ever been. After looking around for a bit, I found something else that was even cooler. As I was walking around, my foot slapped against something underneath the hay. When I brushed the hay to the side, I noticed my foot had hit the handle of a trap door. This was very exciting. I proceeded to clear the hay off the door and then tried to open it. It took a bit of effort to get it open. When I did get it open, I stood there in shock. In the room under this door, there were 3 people. 3 skinny, naked people. They weren't just skinny, they were emaciated. When they saw me, 2 of them began to hiss at me. The third one looked at me, pure hate and anger reflected in his eyes. He began to growl at me and then screamed, "Close the door!" I wasn't able to move at first. I was so utterly shocked I didn't know what to do. I stood there like an idiot holding that trap door. The 2 people who had hissed at me first sank deeper into the darkness of the hole, but the third one, the angry one, sneered. He bolted over on all 4s, and when he got over to the ladder, he began to climb it at an alarming speed. I didn't even have time to close the door. I freaked out and took off at the entrance of the barn. Looking back as I was getting out, the third person had actually gotten out of the room and closed the door. He came running after me. My 12-year-old legs had never run faster before or since. I squeezed out and began running through the woods. Although it wasn't dark outside yet, the sun had gone down enough that it was not very bright. I looked back a couple of times before I got to the trees and saw the guy running on all fours straight at me. Once I got back to the trees, I didn't waste any more time looking back. It got completely dark long before I got home. It was a nightmare going through that forest in the dark, hearing that person still out there. Every sound I heard, every crunched leaf, every snapping of a twig, I jumped and felt like I was being followed. When I got back to my house, I climbed over the barbed wire fence and into my yard. Once there, I booked it till I got in the door. Then I locked it. I told my parents everything I had seen, but they really didn't believe me. My mom just told me I needed to stop making up stories. My dad told me that even if I really had seen such a thing, I had no business going into the barn to begin with. Obviously, the people weren't being held there against their will. He said a lot of weird stuff happens out in the woods, and it was best if I'd just forget about things like that. But how could I forget about it? When I went to sleep in my room that night, my eyes were focused on my window. I expected to look up and see that person looking in at me, his eyes inflamed with rage and hate. Whenever I was in those woods, I felt like I was being watched all the time. So don't ever go into an abandoned building. My grandma and grandpa lived in a very old house. I think it used to be a one-room schoolhouse way back in the day. They put up walls and there was an upstairs sort of attic that was a living quarters, I guess. My grandpa himself built a sort of addition onto the back of the house. That addition was really flimsy though. It was literally just built with boards. There was no outside siding, no insulation, no drywall on the inside. It did have a window that faced into the backyard though. The reason I'm telling you about this particular room is that whenever we took the trip to Grandma and Grandpa's house, that was always the room I slept in. I have to admit as well, it was a very freaky place to sleep. The house was in the opening to a holler. When you looked back through the window, you were looking into a beautiful countryside, but at nighttime it transformed into a dark and frightening scene. Of course, there were no lights at this part of the house at all, and when you were in the room itself, your eyes would get quite used to the dark. When they did, you could see things back there in shadowy movements, tree branches going back and forth, animals out in the wild. This happened in winter when I was 15 years old. My family drove to Grandma's house, and we got there a couple of hours before bedtime. That was what we normally did. We would watch Jeopardy, eat dinner, and go to bed not long after. One thing I remember about this is that when my grandpa got up to do something at one point, I began to rock his chair back and forth with my foot. This was a big no-no with my very superstitious grandparents. They had this weird fixation that if you rocked an empty chair in the house, it would cause someone to die soon. My grandma looked quite worried, and the look on her face told me I should stop doing this immediately. All my life, I'd been the type to stay up late at night, and then sleep in late in the morning. I really liked being up at night, actually. My mind seemed to work better when I was up in the nighttime hours. I went to that room when everyone else went to bed, but I didn't go to sleep right away. Instead, I stayed up for a while reading a book with the not-so-bright lamp in the back room. It was a pretty cold night out, but that didn't really bother me. The bed in the back room had some heavy quilts on it in order to keep warm. There was also an old space heater I could use if it got too cold for me, but those occasions were very rare. There's just something nice, about laying down in the cold weather, warmed up by tons of blankets. I even remember the book I was reading that night, Pet Sematary by Stephen King. I don't normally get scared by books, but this one was really scary. I had to admit I was already a little bit spooked out every time I was in that room. If I didn't want to enjoy the ambiance, though, I guess I wouldn't have been reading a scary book to begin with. As I read on, I would occasionally look up and out the window for a moment. The darkness added to the fear I was feeling from that book. I'm not sure how long I stayed up reading. If you've ever read that book before, I think you'd understand why though. While I'm not the biggest fan of King's work, there's something about the atmosphere of this particular book that really pulled me in. Finally though, I was exhausted. I was thoroughly on edge and ready to go to sleep. The lamp was right by the bed. Once I turned it off, everything was totally dark for a while. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall asleep right away. That's just not what I do. Instead, I laid down and looked out the window and just kinda ruminated in my nighttime thoughts for a while. Eventually, I did doze off. Since I was asleep somewhere other than my own bed though, I tended to sleep in little blocks, you know? Wake up for a few moments, go to sleep over again, wake up, fall back asleep. I was sleeping facing the window, so the first time I woke up, I just looked out into the darkness. I could see a little bit better than before, and I could see the branches of several trees swinging in the wind. After looking at them swaying hypnotically for a few moments, I swiftly went back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it was pretty much the same thing. I saw some swinging branches and fell back asleep. I'm not sure how many times I repeated this, until the moment I woke up and looked out the window once more. This time, in addition to the swaying trees, I saw something out the window. A dark something, but I could tell it was looking in through the window at me. It took my sleepy mind a few moments to realize that I was not dreaming this. All of a sudden, I noticed what looked like a hand reach out from the side of the window and begin to tap on the glass. I heard the tapping distinctly, and I could make out the hand's prints very clearly. I jumped up and out of the bed in shock. I had to do everything I could not to yell out in fear. My impulse was to rush away from the window and out the room, but I resisted that, looking back to the window. Now there was nothing there. I walked over cautiously and peeked out, trying to see if someone was out there or if they were running away into the darkness or something like that. But I didn't see anyone there. It was pitch black. I could hear the trees howling in the wind, but I couldn't make out the figure anymore. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if I was still sleeping and had just dreamed the entire thing, or if someone was skulking outside my room. It took me a long time before I was able to go back to sleep. I told my family about this the next day. My grandma told me something about never rocking the chair without someone sitting in it, suggested perhaps some demon had come for me or something. And that's pretty ridiculous. It did get me thinking, though, that maybe my grandpa had done it to teach me some respect about their beliefs or something. If he did, he never admitted to it. I wouldn't have put it past them, but maybe someone really was just skulking out my room that night. I watch a lot of videos, and I found one where a person was talking about hanging out in the closet and listening to creepypastas. That struck a chord with me, because actually I do that quite a lot too. Once I had a very freaky experience while doing so. I just had to write about it. I mean, what are the chances someone else would be in that same situation I was? Much like the person in that story, I thought it was the best way to try and get scared by these creepypastas. It was the only place in my home I could go where it was completely dark. Once I even tried putting duct tape over my bedroom window to keep the light out, but that didn't work so well. On this particular night, I was sitting there in the closet listening to some really good creepypasta, although I was having a pretty hard time getting into the right mood. I closed my computer lid and tried to listen to it that way. At least then it would be totally dark without the monitor on. That didn't really do very much for me though. It kinda sucked actually. I was hoping that the darkness would really get me into the ambiance and get me scared, you know? That's what the dark is supposed to do. But it just wasn't happening tonight. At least I was having a good time listening to the stories themselves, as they were pretty good. I had been listening to this particularly long playlist and must have been in the closet for about 3 hours. I moved and stood up for a few moments to stretch my legs. It was about 2 in the morning as I did so. Right as I leaned against the closet wall, the closet light turned on. The light switch was right outside the closet door on the left side of it, and I lived alone. That meant someone just flipped that switch, and not only had they just done that, they must be standing right outside the closet door. I froze, finally feeling that fear I'd wanted so badly to feel. Now I was really regretting it though. I had no idea what to do. I didn't have anything to protect myself with. It was just me and my trusty laptop computer in there. All I could do was stand there in complete fear, expecting any moment the door was going to burst open. When it did, I was sure I was going to die. I stood there and watched and listened, but no one opened that door. I waited for hours because I was too scared to check myself. When the sun finally rose, I got the nerve to open up the door myself. I looked around my room. It seemed there was no one there. Cautiously, I staked out the rest of my apartment for a hidden intruder. I didn't find anyone, but I did find my living room window wide open, with the screen removed. My PS4 and my television were gone as well, so I guess I had been robbed. Someone had come into the house who must have known I was there in the closet. Did they scare me because they knew it would give them time to rob me, and I would be too freaked out to explore outside? Or did they think that light was for something else and left when they turned it on and discovered me there? I have no idea, but that was the freakiest experience of my life. Make sure your windows are always secured. When I was about 13 years old, I used to love going to explore out in the hills around my aunt's house. It was really fun, and I often found some really interesting things out there too. One time I stumbled upon this cave. Part of me really wanted to go and explore it, but I knew it really wouldn't be a good idea by myself. I decided to save that for another time. When I went home though, it really began to bother me. I regretted not exploring that cave. I felt like I was some sort of coward some way, and I really didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to go back and find out what was in there. About a month later, I went to stay with my aunt again. This time, I knew I was going to seek out that cave and explore it to its fullest. I brought a flashlight and a snack and some water as well. I didn't really need much because I knew it would be a shallow cave, and it wouldn't take me very long at all. After about an hour of exploring the hills, I finally found that cave again. I guess I should explain the kind of cave it was. It was on the rocky side of a hill, and the entrance was quite short. I would have to get on my belly and push myself under it. Looking at it, I knew it would be an extremely tight fit. My curiosity was really strong though, so I decided to go ahead and go for it. I got down on my belly and slowly began to crawl into that cave. I wasn't sure how deep it was, or if it ever got any taller. What I was sure about was that it was very dark inside. The entrance was so small that not much light was able to get inside it. Thank God I decided to bring the flashlight with me. Right as I began crawling in further though, I became aware of this really odd noise, a sort of rustling sound, followed by a weird shrieking noise. It sent a real shiver down my spine. In a bit of panic, I moved down a bit. I moved my foot and got it wedged in tight between the ceiling and wall. I groaned out of pain and out of desperation for my stupidity. I tried to pull my foot out, but I wasn't able to move it because it was throbbing in agony. I cried out a bit, and then I heard that rustling noise again. It was too dark to see anything, so I grabbed for my flashlight. The sound was probably just nothing, but I would of course be scared until I knew that for sure. I moved my hand on the flashlight and switched it on, then moved it toward the direction of that sound. I saw the worst possible thing. A cave full of the scariest looking bats I'd ever seen, only a couple of yards away from me. They were hanging from the ceiling, and all of them were staring at me. I screamed and did my best to pull myself free. My leg throbbed in agony as I moved. I don't know what it was, the crying or the flashlight, but the bats got restless and they started to fly right at me. Stupidly but instinctively, I swatted at them to defend myself. Two things happened in that moment. My leg finally pulled loose of the wall, and the bats began to bite me because I'd swatted at them. It felt like I was jabbed with sharp, thin needles. I screamed again and tried to pull myself out of that cave. If you've ever seen the movie Terminator, my experience was very similar to Sarah Connor's climbing through the machinery at the end. My leg was injured now, and I was crawling through an area that my body was wedged into. I was panicked and scared of the bats all around me trying to bite me. I was scared I was going to get something real bad because I'd just gotten bit. It took me a long time to crawl my way out. I was breathing heavy with fear, and I had never felt so claustrophobic before. It took me a long time to get out, and by the time I did, I was hyperventilating. I tried to stand up on my foot, but my leg gave out. I had to crawl the rest of the way until I was able to get a broken branch on the ground I could use as a crutch. I was hurting real bad, and I was scared I had probably just contracted rabies. I felt super sick. It took me nearly 3 hours to limp back to my aunt's house. In my gut, I just felt I had rabies and was going to die. If I had been more educated about bats, I would have known that only 0.5% of them actually carry rabies. My feeling of being sick was probably psychosomatic, exacerbated by my fear and anxiety of hurting my foot. But I had to get a rabies shot anyway. It wasn't nearly as bad as people might tell you it is. Still not pleasant by any means, though. Turns out my ankle had been fractured, and I had to get a cast for it. Nowadays, I don't go into small caves or other small areas either. I'm completely claustrophobic, and although more educated about bats now, I'm scared shitless by them. This is the story of the strangest thing that ever happened to me in my life. At the time, I lived in the suburbs of Chicago. I'd just gotten my heart broken not long before this, and was trying to get back into the dating scene if I could. I was quite lonely, and I went for trying to meet someone online. I began to speak with a man named Robbie. He was a bit younger than me, which wasn't something I really liked. I was in my late 20s and he was exactly 20 years old and still lived at home with his parents. He wasn't going to community college at the time either. I would normally have dismissed him because of this, but he was very persistent talking to me, and he seemed to be an interesting person regardless. He liked horror just as much as I did, so that got me interested in the very least trying to meet him. He lived in Wisconsin, but he lived in the rural part of the county. I didn't have a GPS, and this was before smartphones as well, so I had quite a bit of trouble finding his place. Eventually, I was able to find him though, and picked him up. I should mention that all I wanted to do was go and have dinner and talk, get to know each other a little bit. We were getting along very well. He hadn't seen nearly as many movies as I had, and by talking a lot about them, he asked if I wanted to go buy some maybe, go back to his house and watch them together. I was a bit hesitant because he lived with his parents. You probably figured out by now that I'm a gay guy, which I guess I should have mentioned first. I felt really uncomfortable going back with his parents still there. Especially when he told me they didn't even know he was gay. They weren't gay positive at all either. He told me he would tell them that I was just a friend passing through who needed a place to sleep and couldn't afford a hotel. He told me the many things he would tell his parents as lies. You know, this should have been like 1,000 red flags at once, give or take. I was extremely uncomfortable with all of this, but I was on the rebound and Robbie seemed like a likable guy. Despite my apprehension, I decided, why not give it one try? We bought a couple of movies. I don't really recall all of them other than that one was a remake of the movie House of Wax, I think. I mostly only remembered that as well because of the weird shit that happened while we were watching it. After shopping, we drove out to his house again. As I mentioned before, he lived in a very rural part of the county. His house was very old and sat on what I supposed used to be an old farm that was no longer tended to. The fact his house was so isolated made me feel really weird. Things were even stranger when I met his parents. I could tell right away something was off about them, and they didn't seem to like me either. I don't remember much about the father, but the mother was very overbearing. I could tell right away that if they didn't know their son was gay, they at least suspected it very strongly, and they were very, very angry about it. While we were watching the movie, I was sitting in a recliner that was in the middle of the living room. We had the lights off, of course, because it was a horror movie. Although the parents had said they were going to go to bed, there were times when I could hear something shuffling and sneaking behind me. I would turn around, only to see the mother peeking around the corner of the dark hallway, watching me. She would linger there for a moment, before seeing I'd noticed her, and sprinting around the corner. Her absences would never last long, though. She would creep back through the darkness of the hallway, and hide and keep watching me. There was one very scary moment. We were watching that House of Wax movie, only for me to turn around and notice her hiding in a doorway again, this time holding a knife in her hand. She held the handle with one hand and was lightly slapping the flat part of the blade with her other. I certainly knew she was not doing anything in the kitchen at the moment. It was even more scary because I knew she knew I'd keep looking back and catching her there. This was something she wanted me to see. I really should have left right then and there, but Robbie didn't seem to think anything was going on. For some reason, the idiot in me decided not to leave. Robbie told his mom we were going to go to sleep. He showed her he'd made up a bed on the floor of his room for me to sleep on. Then he closed the door. He waited until she was gone in order to lock it. I laid down on the floor, not really knowing what was going on here. Robbie asked me to come up to the bed to cuddle with him. I liked him a lot, but I'm sure everyone listening to this story can realize how blind I must have been by this point. I guess I really, really liked him. I should have never gotten into this position. Needless to say, I didn't sleep so well. There were several times throughout the night I could hear the doorknob being turned and scraped against. I knew that was dear old Mom checking to see if the door was locked. She was probably trying to open the door as well, to see if anything particularly gay was going on. This happened no less than 5 times. Each time it did, all I could think about was her standing there in the darkness with a knife in her hand. Somehow I managed to survive the night. The way his mother had acted didn't seem to bother Robbie at all either. He went through the entire experience as if nothing had ever happened. He was also completely oblivious to the fact his mom knew he was gay and was willing to try and scare his date with a knife in order to keep him from being so. I left the house as soon as possible to avoid encountering Mom again. Not long after, I got a call from Robbie. His mom told him I wasn't allowed to come back, and he was really confused. Didn't matter much to me. I wouldn't have gone back there if he paid me. Strangely enough, not long after, Robbie decided he didn't really feel like being gay anymore. Last I knew of him, he was dating some girl in his church group. I really hope his mom didn't threaten him or something like that. The whole thing was way too weird and scary, and I was happy to never have to meet any of these people again. Like an idiot though, a while later I looked him up on Facebook, and to my surprise, I found him. Honestly, what I found is pretty disturbing though. It seems like he went through periods of acceptance, then suppressed them again. Eventually, he even started to support conversion therapy, and believing that being gay can be cured. Having one's true identity suppressed can be the scariest thing of all. This was clearly a kid who was severely brainwashed, and didn't have the slightest clue of what was going on. That's pretty scary. There was an old abandoned cat shelter just outside of town. It had garnered quite a reputation concerning why it was closed down. The prevailing but ludicrous theory was that they'd allowed a stray cat in there that had some sort of rare flesh-eating disease they weren't able to screen for, and therefore they weren't able to detect it before putting it in with all the other cats. All the others supposedly died, and the shelter lost all its funding as a result and was forced to shut down. Some people claim there were tons of dead cat bodies in the building just because they hadn't even bothered to clean it out before they'd left. Obviously, that story was made up. It was so far over the top that no one with half a brain would ever believe it. It did lend an air of mystery and foreboding about this abandoned building, though. I myself used to always be really curious about this shelter. I wanted to go in and see what it was like inside. I knew it would probably just be boring, but I wouldn't know for sure unless I checked it out first. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to break into the building. I had to wait until it was around midnight because I didn't want to worry about being seen by other people. It was creepy, approaching this building in the dark, but I did have a flashlight on me. I had to search around quite a bit, but eventually I found a broken window in the back of the building to climb into. This was convenient. I didn't really want to cause any more damage to this building. The last thing I needed was a vandalism charge on an old, broken, run-down building. Once I got inside, I began to search around in the various rooms. Much like I had originally expected, the shelter was not as interesting in reality as it was in theory. There was a lot of old furniture, some shelves and documents, but there were no bodies of dead cats lying strewn about. There wasn't anything that indicated in any way why the place had closed down. It was just an old, broken-down building. As I was exploring, though, I heard a noise coming from down the hallway. Looking down from that direction, I could see it was coming from a room that seemed to be a huge cat playroom. They had a big cat tree, and it was closed off by a screen. I was curious. Perhaps a cat or some other sort of animal had snuck in there. I wanted to check this out. I entered the area around the screen and shone my flashlight all over the area, not really seeing much of anything at first. I then saw something moving underneath the cat tree. I shone my light on it. It looked like a blanket with something moving under. I moved closer to the screen, figuring I was safe. Whatever I was looking at was way in the middle of the play area, but definitely something was moving. I kept looking at it, trying to figure out what was going on. It was then that I noticed the blanket being pulled slightly to the side and saw someone's eyes peeking out at me. He looked directly into the flashlight. He probably wasn't able to make out much about me, but as soon as he saw me, he pulled the blanket down and glared at me. "Stay away from my kitties. Leave my kitties alone!" He got up and threw the blanket to the side. The man ran up to the screen, causing me to step back and trip in shock. I fell right on my side. The man pressed his face against the screen and began to chew on the mesh. He repeated, "Leave my kitties alone." I could see him slobbering all over as he pressed his face up against it. It was then I noticed he was holding what looked like the dead body of an animal, which I assumed to be a cat. One hand was vigorously petting it as he yelled at me and gnashed at the screen. It was hard to tell what was going on, but I didn't want to wait around to find out. He didn't seem like he wanted to kill me or anything, but I didn't want to take the chance and find out what he did want to do. I jumped off my side and took off running out the door. As I ran back to the window I had crawled into, I could hear the man yelling at me, telling me to leave his kittens alone. It was freaky. I heard the man's voice clearly behind me, even as I was crawling out through the window. After I got out, I could hear him screaming and crying and howling. I ran as far away from that place as I could. I suppose the experience wasn't life-alteringly scary, but it was pretty creepy in the moment when it happened. The man was obviously disturbed, and that was the worst part of it. It was nice to know that the animal shelter was simply an abandoned building. I figured the guy was a homeless man who moved in or something, but obviously he'd let the place get to him. I live in a medium-sized apartment building in a fairly major city. While the neighborhood I live in is more on the safe side, violence is very high in my city as a whole, and we have a big fashion problem as well. Despite this, I feel pretty safe going out, especially close to my apartment building, where it's mostly well lit. I'm friendly as well with a few of the regular homeless people, so they usually look out for me. Last night, I got a reminder that my safety isn't guaranteed though, and I've been pretty shaken ever since. Last night, at around 12:20 a.m., I asked my partner if he wanted to share a joint with me. When he declined, I locked the apartment and went downstairs myself. The exit I take spits me out onto the main street, where there will still be the occasional car driving by at this time. Usually this type of human presence comforts me walking late at night, but tonight, a lone black van approached my peripheral and started to drive slowly behind me, matching my walking pace until I rounded the corner. The van was stopped by a stoplight then. I found it very strange at the time, of course, but the van was on the other side of the street, and there were 1 to 2 other cars as well. I kinda brushed it off a little bit. Around the corner, there was a little food truck area with a bunch of picnic tables. They had these Christmas string lights hung up, and a few other ambient lights that were kept on the whole night. It barely illuminated the area though. As I was walking past the picnic tables, I noticed a large man dressed in dark clothes, sitting alone in the dark at one of the back tables. He was wearing some kind of hood that covered his whole face. I could still tell though that his eyes were following me as I walked along. My usual smoke spot was behind a fence on the other side. I was a little shaken by spotting that guy, so I chose a slightly further spot against the side of a construction vehicle. I lit my joint and started puffing away, reading something or other on my phone. I soon started to get a very uneasy sensation though. My hairs were standing up on end, and I got the most intense goosebumps I've ever felt. My phone was still playing music. As I turned it off, I could hear shifting and rustling of gravel on the ground right behind me. I swung my head around, only to see a man reaching towards me with his hands. I only caught a glimpse of his face before I fell to the ground. His eyes were wide and bulging, and they terrified me. His mouth was agape, and he was basically snarling at me. He scared me so bad I fell to the ground, stumbled, and broke into a run in all of 1 second. I ran for a few moments before I peeked over my shoulder and saw him following a couple of yards behind me. At this point, I saw it was definitely the same man who had been sitting at the picnic table. I saw he was wearing what looked like a dirty fishing hat. He had shoulder-length, dirty, light-colored hair and was way bigger than me. He was definitely gaining on me too. I had lost ground by turning around, and I was not in the best shape to begin with. I was about to reach the first entrance to the building. Issue was, 1, there were double doors at this entrance that closed quite slowly, and 2, the only way up was an elevator, so if he got inside with me, I was out of luck. I kept running, of course, taking my chances with my running ability versus my quickly opening doors ability. I kept running along the other side of the building to get to the second entrance. This one was just 2 single doors, which opened up to the stairwell. As I was nearing this entrance, I noticed another man who appeared to be running straight towards me from the opposite direction. I should note as well that throughout this, I had been hearing the guy behind me growling and snarling. As the second man got closer, I could hear he was growling at me too. I reached the keypad and unlocked the first door, then quickly slammed it closed behind me. The second man reached the door first. I could see his face more clearly as it slammed against the glass window of the door. He was taller than the other guy, with longer hair as well. Mostly I remember his wild eyes and his teeth gnashing at me like an animal right before I turned away. I opened the second door and booked it up the stairs. I didn't even stop until I was in my apartment, had all the doors locked and was under the covers. I think in retrospect, I didn't hear any sign of them following me up the stairs, but I was convinced they were still on my tail in that moment. I think the only reason I got away from them was that they didn't know about the side entrance to my building. They hadn't expected me to keep running past the first one. I got up to get my inhaler since I was having a near asthma attack at this point. As I walked by the window, I peeked out and my heart sank. I saw the same van that had been following me earlier, parked right across the street from the entrance to my building. I looked down further to see 3 men pacing along the side, including the 2 who had been chasing me. I ducked down, fearing they would see me. A few minutes later, they started shining flashlights into the windows of all the apartments. At first, I thought they were focusing on mine, but after a while, it was clear they were searching for which one I'd gone to. At this point, I tried to call my building manager to let him know about the situation. He sent an emergency text alert to our all-building list. I was extremely paranoid that another innocent person would be accosted by them, so I called the police as well. They told me they were on their way, and to stay out of the windows just in case they were armed. A few minutes later, the men were spooked by a faraway police siren, and they all jumped in the van together and peeled away. I spent a long sleepless night thinking they'd come back, but they never did. Definitely going to avoid being alone at night from now on. I asked one of the homeless guys I'm friends with if he saw anything suspicious last night, but he said he hadn't. They couldn't have been residents either, because they hadn't left or reacted after management sent that emergency text. The part that sticks with me the most is the growling and the intense look in their eyes. I don't know if they were on drugs or what, but they never said any words to me or each other. Haven't heard any updates from the cops, but it's only been a few hours. They didn't seem that interested in my statement, as the van had already disappeared when they left. I lived for a while in an Ohio town that wasn't far away from Wheeling, West Virginia. This was quite a long time ago, mind you, and I was only there for about a year. I'm having a really hard time trying to actually remember the name of it. I suppose that's not too important, though. What is important is that I was 13 years old at the time. I had an older brother and a younger sister as well. I really didn't like being around my parents at that time. I was really happy during the summer of that year when I got to stay for about a month at my aunt's house. She lived way out in the country, as my family always put it, although I always thought that sounded a bit weird. I mean, technically, doesn't everyone live in their country? I guess I didn't really understand. This was back in the 1980s, so there wasn't as much readily available entertainment as there is today. We would get to have a frozen pizza every Friday and have to go into town to rent some videos. We would always opt for cheesy 80s horror movies and stay up really late. I saw a lot of VHS horror that summer, but for the rest of the days, we would have to make our own entertainment. It was particularly hot inside that day. My aunt only had a couple of fans, and they weren't doing their best. My aunt only had a couple of fans to cool the place down, and they weren't exactly doing the best job that day. There was a slight breeze outside, and it was actually much cooler to just go out there and play around. We decided to go for a bit of a walk. The road my aunt lived on was paved with gravel. She lived in this very beautiful rural area with very few homes around. The road was actually a pleasant walk during the summer. It was at the bottom of many hills which had tons of shading trees upon them. At this time of day, they were casting their shadow across the road, making it the coolest place my cousin and I could be at the time. We were walking for a while, and as I mentioned before, there was a cool and consistent breeze this day. I would say the wind was at about 16 miles per hour maybe. We were having a jolly old time, just talking about some things going on in our lives. All of a sudden though, my cousin stopped walking, and he got this very odd look upon his face. He looked off into the distance, in the trees on the hill. I asked him if something was wrong. He took a moment, and then responded, "I don't know, I thought I just heard something, but I guess I can't be sure." He sort of narrowed his eyes, as if he was searching for something up on that hill. After a moment, though, he just shook his head. The two of us began to walk again. It was Friday afternoon, and once my aunt got home from work, we were going to go and pick up our videos for the night. We were discussing what we were going to rent. I very distinctly remember him mentioning wanting to watch The Monster Squad. That wasn't really a horror movie at all, though. We both heard the same noise coming from the trees just then. It was not just the sound of footfalls crunching upon the leaves, but we could also hear someone who sounded like they were breathing quite heavily. Finally, we saw something accompanying this sound as well. Just 20 feet ahead of us, someone suddenly burst out of the trees. A man much bigger and older than either of us, dressed in all shabby clothing. I remember clearly he was wearing a denim jacket and what looked to be a baseball cap as well. That was not what stood out most about this man, though. The man was covered in blood. He also seemed panicked and shocked to see us when he looked over to us. I could understand why. There was a lot of forest around here, and not a lot of people. Running out onto this road, more often than not, you would be all alone. The man seemed unsure of what to do, and just stared us down for a moment. We were frozen in place, also not sure what to do. The man then moved forward, as if he was going to rush at us. He quickly stopped himself, though. He seemed to rethink his choice for a moment. Instead, he turned and ran off in the other direction. We didn't follow him, of course, as the two of us were already scared enough. Remember, we had been watching a lot of scary movies that summer, and this seemed like a scene right out of one of them. The last thing we needed to do was follow someone who might be crazy, dangerous, or both. My cousin even thought that maybe that guy had just killed someone out in the woods. He suggested we should go and see if someone was out there. If the man really had attacked someone and that someone was still alive, then it wouldn't be good to just walk away, now would it? I agreed, and besides, we were two 13-year-old boys. We should be able to handle ourselves. We cautiously started up the hill in the area we had seen the madman run down from. I would like to tell you I was being brave as hell, but honestly, I was terrified the entire time. I kept expecting the guy to loop back around and ambush us from behind or something. When we got to the top of the hill and were making our way down to the other side, we hoped to find something. Eventually, we did find something, but it completely changed what we had perceived had happened. There was a creek not too far from where we were, and we could see a huge man hanging over it. His back was turned towards us, but we could tell what he was doing. He had this large knife and was wiping it off in the creek water. We didn't have to say anything to each other. We both realized what we were seeing and what had actually happened. We also realized we might be in some big trouble right now. As quiet as we could, we crept behind two trees. Still curious, though, the two of us kept looking out from behind the tree at the man by the creek. We were very fortunate he didn't appear to notice us. After the guy had cleaned his knife off of all the blood and dried it off, he sheathed it once more. Then he took off in the opposite direction of us. I breathed a silent sigh of relief, because this guy was even bigger and scarier looking than the guy we had seen running out onto the road. Once this guy was gone, we still waited for a while before heading back down the hill. We had seen enough scary movies to know you can never know if the killer would come back at any moment. We didn't feel safe until we got back down to the road. Once we did, we hurried back to my aunt's house. We told them what we had seen, and strangely enough, they didn't seem to be very concerned at all. They still slept with the house unlocked as they always did, and I never really found out what happened in that situation. I did know it was much scarier than any of the movies that we watched, though. A lot of neighborhoods have quote-unquote haunted houses in them. You know the exact kind I mean. Houses that are for some reason abandoned and boarded up for a long time. No one really seems to know why, so all the children just decide the house must be haunted or something. The older kids make up weird stories about it, just in order to scare their siblings and their friends. It's always just a bunch of but it becomes legend with the kids in the neighborhood. My neighborhood had something even better than that. You see, we had this old abandoned hospital. That's all I really knew about it, really. I knew it had been abandoned for a very long time. The kids in the neighborhood all claimed it was a mental hospital, but I never really verified that for sure. We had this little town legend about it, at least amongst us kids. So the story went that this was a mental hospital, but when they closed it down, the patients were released back into society. One of the patients, a man the kids called Lucky, not the cleverest nickname, but we're kids after all, considered the place to be his home and returned to living in it years afterward. Supposedly, this man lived in the basement and would try to kill anyone who ever entered his home. The kids in the neighborhood would always dare each other to break in and spend time in that old hospital. No one would ever actually do it, though. I'd been dared before myself. The closest I'd ever gotten was climbing over the gate. Once I was on the other side, though, I'm not too proud to admit I chickened out immediately and hopped back over. There was one kid in the neighborhood that did take the dare completely, so this story is not a first-hand account of what happened inside. It almost scared me to death not knowing what really happened to him. I was a high school freshman on Halloween. A bunch of us headed down to the hospital to go about the usual daring. Some of us would go right up to the gate, begin to climb over, and then chicken out right away. One kid, though, that I didn't really know well, named Tom, was teasing us all mercilessly for being such cowards. He kept telling us that the stories of Lucky were just a bunch of baloney, and we were dumb for being so scared. About 6 of us had all chickened out and were being teased by this guy. We'd had enough of his power. We told Tom that unless he was willing to put his money where his mouth was, he needed to shut the hell up. We were wrong in assuming that Tom was going to chicken out like us, though. He readily accepted our challenge and began to climb over the gate. He climbed over easily and jumped down on the other side. Then he waved at us and walked over to the door of the hospital. He actually tried to open the door as well. That was more than any of us had ever done before. It didn't work, though. The door was locked. This actually gave Tom the chance to back out, but he didn't. After looking around for a bit, he found a large rock and used it to shatter one of the windows. We all got worried, of course. We thought the noise would attract somebody to the site, but that didn't happen. Tom broke the glass out of the basement window and then carefully lowered himself inside and out of sight. We were all pretty shocked at this point and a bit ashamed of ourselves as well. The shame that we felt, though, in no way compared to the paranoia that settled in on us as we waited for Tom to come back out. At first, we were just impressed he'd even gone in. Then, we were more impressed that he was staying in there for quite a while. And that feeling of being impressed, though, began to fade into worry. Longer and longer, Tom still did not come back out of the hospital. It was bad enough when an hour had passed, even worse when 2 hours had passed, and absolutely dreadful when nearly 4 hours had passed by and not a single peep from Tom. It really began to bug us. We weren't sure why he hadn't come back out yet, but we were definitely speculating on it. Our first thought was that he was taking his time to try and scare us. The worst thought, and the one that became more and more realistic to us kids as time went on, was that Tom must have really come across Lucky, and he must have been unhappy to have someone invading his home. And Tom's disappearance put us all in a bad place. We weren't supposed to be hanging out here. If he didn't come back, we were going to have to go to our parents or the police, and neither of those choices were going to be easy. When Tom still didn't emerge for 6 hours, we went directly to the police. Maybe we should have gone to our parents first in hindsight, because when the cops called our parents out of the blue, the situation got even worse. I got chewed out in front of all the cops and all the other parents as well. While the chewing out was quite bad, what happened when the cops went to the hospital to look for Tom was much worse. They searched the entirety of the property. The basement, the rooms, the hallways, everything. There was not a single trace of Tom or anybody else. The police figured he must have just exited the building somewhere else and left us waiting on the outside for him, although Tom still hadn't returned home yet. The police told his parents he was probably just playing out this prank, but Tom didn't return that night, nor did he return the next day. He didn't return the next week. Search parties looked for him throughout the town, but he wasn't there. The hospital was searched more than once, and nothing was found. No Tom, no Lucky, no indication other than the window that Tom broke that anybody had ever been there at all. Posters with Tom's picture were put up in the post office and in stores, but he never showed up. This happened in the 70s, and to this day I have no idea what happened that night. Tom was never found. The guilt I've felt throughout the years is pretty bad, but not nearly as bad as the wondering. I never saw Tom again. I don't know what happened to him when he went into that abandoned hospital. So this happened well over a decade ago. Thinking about it still sends shivers down my spine though. It was a hot summer day, and me, 11, my sister, 9, and a friend of ours who was 11 as well, decided to enjoy it with the other kids in the park. The park was some distance away from our houses, essentially in another neighborhood altogether. A bus would have taken us 15 minutes to get there, but we decided to walk to and from the park on this day. It was summer after all, and we enjoyed playing along the way there and doing the usual kids stuff too. Now, the city we lived in was pretty safe, and it was common for kids to undertake such journeys without the supervision of parents or other adults. After the 30-minute walk, we arrived at the park and had a blast together. We played for a couple of hours and bite ice cream in a nearby shop before heading home. We enjoyed our soft frozen treats and sang silly songs, strolling in the general direction of our neighborhood, when I suddenly got the feeling that someone was right behind us. I turned my head around just for a second, as I just couldn't shake that strange feeling. I could see a man walking some good distance behind us. I remember noticing he was wearing a black coat. That was very strange, being it was the middle of August and super hot outside. I looked again, this time a bit closer. The man was not only wearing a black coat, he was wearing black shoes, a dark hat, and sunglasses as well, making it all but impossible to see his face. What really freaked me out, though, was the fact that on second glance his ankles and calves were bare, no socks, and most importantly, no pants. He was also a bit closer than he had been just a second ago. Not wanting to freak out my younger sister, I whispered to my friend that I thought the man may be following us. She took a look and made a panicked expression upon seeing the man herself. We were now walking on the main road, but there were no houses around, just a wooded area and bushes on both sides. I knew we were both asking the same question. Where the hell had this man come from? Even as a child, I was fairly level-headed and didn't tend to make a fuss about things. I wanted to put this weird guy following us theory to the test. I touched my sister's shoulder and screamed, "Tag, you're it!" and started running, my friend following as well. As we ran, I turned around to check, and sure as hell, the creepy man had started running to keep pace with us. My stomach dropped, and I screamed to both my sister and my friend that the man was following us, and we needed to run. Chaos ensued in that moment. My sister, upon seeing the man for the first time, and being a smart kid, quickly put two and two together and started crying furiously. The man was some distance away, and we were three pretty fast kids, aware of a few shortcuts as well. This meant we were able to get ahead of him, though it didn't stop us from crying while running. We ran like I remember it all being a blur until we essentially crashed into an old man. This man was well known in our neighborhood, a good-natured homeless man who survived by selling trinkets and junk. He was well liked in the community for his good nature, so people would buy to help him out often. We begged him for help and screamed at him at the top of our lungs, panicked and pointing at the man, who mind you was still running right behind us. When he saw us pointing him out, he abruptly stopped in place. The old homeless man quickly rushed us home, saying he would take care of everything. To this day, I couldn't thank him enough. We made it safely to my friend's house, where her grandmother did her best to calm us down. Sometime after, the old homeless man told my grandmother that he was sure the guy had been following us and had ill intentions as well. He'd stopped the strange man and pretended to sell him some broken watches to give us a chance to run. He told us he believed the guy was completely naked under his coat and planned on at least flashing us, if not something far worse. The strange guy got upset and told him he didn't want his fucking watches. Then he sprinted back in the direction he'd come from. The story quickly spread in the area, and parents and kids were mindful that there may still be a sicko out and about. As far as I know, though, there were no further incidents, thankfully. So let me start off by saying I really like to explore old mines. It's kind of a thrill for me because I'm mildly claustrophobic. That sounds weird, I know. Why would someone explore an old mine if they're scared of enclosed places? The thing about it though is that it really gives you a kind of a rush. When I was a kid, I got lost in a cave, you see, and although it did freak me out quite a bit, it also made me feel so alive. When I began to explore though, I chose mines instead of caves because mines are harder to get lost in. Caves are a lot more scary in my mind. Generally, I just travel to the end of the available mine, my heart pounding in my chest the whole way. Then I'd try to get out as quickly as possible. Each and every time I swore to myself I would never again go into another mine. But I'd always get the itch to go just once more, almost immediately after I'd left. I was going to explore a mine in West Virginia. I won't mention the name of it because technically I didn't have a legal right to be there. I actually even had to park my car on the side of the highway and walk there, which was a pretty big risk. There were no cars coming for a while, so I jumped the railing and the fence and made my way over toward that mine. I had done tons of research to try and find where this place was online, so I was able to figure it out pretty quickly. I knew this one was going to be a relatively straight trip from the portal/entrance to the mine to the back. It was about 1,000 feet deep or so. There was a chance that by the time I got to the end, I wouldn't even be able to see the entrance anymore. My heart instantly began racing as I thought of that. Fortunately, although the mine was a bit damp, it wasn't very wet like some of the others I'd encountered, so I wouldn't be having too difficult a time. So there I was entering the mine, and of course my heart started beating faster right away. I had to walk very slowly because I didn't want to get surprised and trip on anything. No one knew where I was, so if I got hurt, no one would be able to find me, and I'd have to get out of trouble myself. I made a habit of turning around every 50 feet or so to look around and make sure I could still see the entrance. Of course, it got smaller and smaller the further I went into the mine, and the more my heart thudded in my ears and my chest. When I'd gotten halfway deep into the mine, I turned around and saw the entrance was now very, very far away. It was just barely visible. The mine was so dark, too. I had a small flashlight with me to see where I was going, but I didn't want to use it until I absolutely had to. As I mentioned before, the only reason I did this in the first place was because I so enjoyed the thrill of being scared that the flashlight would have kept me from being so. As I descended further into this mine, I thought I heard a sudden sound. It sounded a bit like a giggle or something. I immediately stopped in my tracks and tried to listen a bit closer. After a few moments of nothing though, I decided it must have just been in my head. I began to walk a bit further. About 700 feet into the mine, I heard that same giggle once more. I again stopped, this time feeling my heartbeat leap into my throat. I turned around and looked at how deep I was in. I considered going back for a moment, but I figured this must just be in my imagination. Who the hell would be down here other than me? I wanted to make it as far in as I could go, so I kept on walking. When I got closer to the end of the mine, I heard that giggle again. Only thing was, this particular time, I was absolutely sure I just heard this, close by too. It was not my imagination. This time it didn't stop either. It was coming from right behind me. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out my flashlight. I flipped it on, turning around. Sitting right in front of me were two little girls, holding their hands over their mouths while they were laughing. They looked at me, and in the darkness their eyes looked completely black. One of the girls took her hand away from her mouth for a moment and pointed behind me further into the mine. I dropped my flashlight in surprise. It broke on the rocks, but I didn't care about that right then. The laughing didn't stop, even though I couldn't see either of them anymore. Immediately, I began to sprint my way back out of the mine. The giggling didn't seem to get any quieter though. Actually, I thought those girls must be following me. It remained almost completely dark until I was almost back to the entrance of the cave. I didn't dare to look back. I hopped out of that mine and ran to my car, which fortunately was right where I had left it. That was not my last time in an abandoned mine, but I can tell you it was the last time I ever went to that one. While out one night, I ran into a guy who was a really good friend of one of my ex-boyfriends. We hung out a bit that night, but there wasn't really any flirtation or anything between us. My ride wanted to go home, but I wasn't quite ready to leave myself. The guy said he would bring me home when the club closed in an hour. I had hung out with this guy many times before and never felt anything was wrong with him. I was not anticipating what would happen this night. We got into his car like usual and started on the way home. We got on the interstate, only for him to miss my exit. I told him he just missed the pass, and he told me, "Yeah, I know, we're going to my place." In this moment, I knew something was off. I told him it was too late. I really just wanted to get home. He kept insisting I sleep over at his house and was not going to take no for an answer. I had never planned to visit that place in my entire life, but still I decided to play it cool. Maybe I could just crash on the sofa and make him take me home first thing in the morning. We get to his apartment, walk into the door, it's a bedroom. Apparently he lived in a studio apartment, so it was one big room with a bathroom and that was it. No sofa, just a single bed. He walked in first. He closed the door behind me and immediately turned the lights off. I couldn't see a single thing. He must have blacked out the windows because it was pitch black inside. He grabbed me and threw me against the bed. I was completely freaking out at this point. It was immediately clear he had no intentions of just letting me go to sleep. He kept on trying to touch me, kiss me, get me to cuddle up next to him. I kept thinking that if my ex knew what he was doing right now, he'd be very pissed. I tried to push him off, only for him to try again. Somehow, this went on for about an hour. I just wanted this night to be over. I knew I needed to do something, because he was a built man, and I was just a petite young woman. I didn't know how long I could defend myself from his assault. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face either. I pushed him off once more, got up, and walked until I found a wall. Luckily, he wasn't able to see me either. I was able to feel around for the bathroom door handle. I went into the bathroom and closed the door behind me. I didn't know what my next move should be. Unfortunately, this was before cell phones, so I couldn't call anyone for a ride. All of a sudden, he shoved the door against my back and managed to fling it open. Then he told me to get the fuck out and that he was bringing me home. He was steaming mad, too. I ran out of the apartment. I got into the car and he didn't say a single word the entire way. He brought me home without a word said between us. I knew I'd just dodged a serious bullet, but I had no clue how serious it could have been until years later. This guy eventually went on to rape his girlfriend's 5-year-old daughter so severely she had to have reconstructive surgery. He pleaded guilty and is now in prison for a long time. A couple of years ago, my parents went on a vacation together, and me and my ex-boyfriend who lived with us at the time stayed home. I was around 17 at the time this happened. One of these days, it all got to be too much for me, and I decided to kick the mentally abusive asshole out of our house and break things off cleanly. I decided I needed to take my mind off of things and called one of my friends who lived in a city an hour away from me. She was fine with me coming over, so I took the first train there, and we met up at the train station. By this time, it was somewhere around 2300. This city is known for not being the safest, and she lived in one of the sketchiest parts of town. I'm not much of a scaredy cat myself, so I didn't really think too much of it. We grabbed something to eat real quick, and we're off on our way to her house. We had been walking for all of 10 minutes when suddenly this huge guy on a bike started riding next to us. He greeted us way too happily and started talking right away with this huge smile on his face. Immediately, I felt stressed out by this behavior. He was acting way too enthusiastic towards us. We kinda tried to make it clear we had no interest in talking to him without being rude. He continued to follow us for 5 more minutes. I was starting to realize there weren't any people ahead of us, and to any outsiders, it seemed like this guy and us must know each other and were having a normal conversation. All of a sudden though, just when I was beginning to get freaked out, he looked behind him a couple of times. I swear to God, I was sure we were going to be murdered in just a moment. Instead, he leaned in and softly whispered to us, "I'm sorry for freaking you out. I saw you guys leave the food place. I saw a couple of guys start pointing at you and stand up to follow you. I decided to follow as well in case they had any bad intentions. And just keep walking. Pretend you know me." I looked behind me. Sure enough, there was a group of 4 people, all dressed in black and covering their faces, following behind us. I had seen them when we were grabbing food. The chance of them leaving the place at the same time to walk the exact same way was so small, I was sure they were following us. I don't know what that group of guys following us intended to do, but they followed us for quite a ways. They never tried anything in the end though. Basically, the guy just biked next to us the entire time until we arrived at my friend's house. We texted her male roommate to come downstairs, and the 4 of us stayed in front of the door, talking as the group of guys passed us by. They disappeared down a random corner. We didn't want to send the guy on his bike on his merry way right away. We were afraid the group would go after him because he'd helped us. I just recently got a new job at the time this happened. At my job, there was this one guy who used to watch me whenever he was around. We didn't actually work together, but we did work in the same department. All the weird stuff started a few months after I'd started and moved within walking distance to my new job. One October night, I was walking home when a tall man wearing a hoodie suddenly walked out of some bushes I happened to be walking by. I found this extremely strange, of course. As I looked back before I entered my apartment, I noticed the man now standing by some trees, seemingly not noticing I'd seen him and watching me. When he realized I did, he jumped behind the trees to hide. I told my boyfriend and he just thought it was a drug dealer. Anyway, I started walking a different trail after. About a month later though, I saw the same man. This time though, he was crouching behind the trailer of some parking lot. He got up and started to walk away from me, pretending to be casual, but I knew he was still watching me. After a week, he showed up again, but this time I was halfway to my home. He came out of hiding from behind the trailer and started to walk toward me. I beelined for my apartment's door and ran inside. This time I knew he'd seen which apartment I lived in, as the previous times I would walk around the front door so he wouldn't know. This time he caught me off guard though. He seemed like he was trying to figure out where I lived, as he could have easily attacked me multiple times. It doesn't end there though. I got laid off at some point and got another new job. After 3 weeks of working there, I was getting on the bus when a man who looked incredibly similar to the guy in the parking lot was watching me get on. I quickly hurried to the back of the bus. When we got to my stop, the man pulled the string and got off. I was about to get off as well, but I decided to wait for this guy to keep on walking. Unfortunately, he slowed down his pace, seemingly waiting for me. I ended up walking behind him until we got to some lights and he wouldn't move. I decided to run and hide from him in case he was looking for my new job's location. During the entire time I worked there, I saw my ex-coworker on the train when I was heading back from my interviews. He saw me going the same direction as him and started running. He ran pretty slowly, like he had a limp or something. It was kind of strange. Anyway, I also saw him hanging out the mall whenever I was there with my mom. I guess it was a popular place though, so it could have been a coincidence. I got laid off again due to complications from work and had a month where I didn't go outside much. After that month, I got another new job within walking distance. After 1 week there, though, I was leaving work and noticed a man just watching me again. He looked incredibly similar, too. I ran away and got to some lights, but I didn't see him anymore. For a month and a bit, actually, no one followed me. One night, though, it was relatively warm. I was closing close to midnight and was walking home when I noticed a white car parked behind a store, seemingly out of view of any cameras. I was already suspicious, as it seemed to be idling and it looked like someone was sitting inside, too. I was walking by it and kept looking over my shoulder at it. Not a second went by when I got the feeling I should look behind me. I look and see my ex-coworker right there. I started running as fast as I could. The adrenaline helped me get away. I didn't look back until I cleared some space between us and couldn't see him anymore. Luckily, there happened to be some people waiting for the bus at the end of the road. Another month went by and I didn't see him again. I assumed he must have been on vacation or something, as he showed up exactly a month later. One night in early May, I was walking to a grocery store to pick up some groceries I really needed. As I'm walking there, some person disguised in a hoodie came up from behind me. He started walking toward the bus terminal, trying to act casual. I think he overheard my conversation with my boyfriend, telling him I was going to the grocery store to pick up some stuff. I got there, got my stuff, and just as I was about to start walking home, I saw that same guy dressed like a teenager standing outside the grocery store. He was watching me, clearly trying to get close to me without being noticed. I started telling my boyfriend to get me an Uber instead. I walked over to some bags of fertilizer to hide. He went and started to search for me. I let him know that I knew he was up to something messed up, and he stared back at me with these soulless eyes. Luckily, exactly at that moment, my Uber showed up and I hopped in. After that, I was extremely paranoid, of course, always on the lookout for this guy. I made my boyfriend meet me after work whenever it was dark out. A few days after no more bizarre events, my boyfriend came and met with me. This night, I noticed a car with its headlights on parked in front of a store we had to pass by. We started walking by it when it slowly started driving away, the person inside seemingly watching us. We got to some lights, and I saw the same car now in another plaza closer, driving slowly and watching us. Freaked out, I told my boyfriend. I assumed it was once again my ex-coworker, as the car looked a lot like his mom's car. I had seen his mom come to pick him up at work once, and she was driving a car exactly like this one. The next night, we saw a man with a black van with the passenger door wide open, hovering around it. As we passed by, he started to follow us, so we ran until we got a bit further away. 10 minutes later, see some guy disguised in a hoodie hiding behind a building with his back against the wall. He tried to follow us too. I don't know if those incidents are related, but it sure terrified me and my boyfriend. Mind you, I used to walk home by myself without incident for a long time. After this, I changed my hours at work, even though my managers gave me a hard time despite all this insane crap happening to me. I got my managers to give me rides home anytime I had to close, or I would get Ubers. I never walked again at midnight, or even after 10 p.m. I ended up seeing my ex-coworker's car multiple times still. Eventually, I did stop seeing his car when he realized I would never be out again after midnight. Anyway, I started getting morning shifts at work. I finally didn't have to close anymore. I don't know if I'm done being stalked or not though. Last month, the sun was starting to set around 9ish. I was walking by myself to the grocery store when I saw my ex-coworker drive past me. I ignored it as I've seen him in this area before, probably just unrelated. 30 minutes later, as I'm walking back with my boyfriend though, I see him watching me in the parking lot. He was back, lurking around. He saw my boyfriend and I and started to walk away, but kept an eye on us until we got into our apartment. Unfortunately, due to having in-person classes at my university, I'm back to working until 10 p.m. I'm worried it's going to start back up in earnest again. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in the comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.